After he had performed the service dictated by his love, he took his garments again and sat down. Verse 12. See also Hebrews 10, verses 10 through 12. A third end he had in view was that of setting an example of charity and hospitality, particularly of humanity and all the offices of brotherly kindness. Verses 13 through 17. It was foreign to the Jewish manners for a teacher to wash the feet of his disciple. It is contrary to the manners of any country for the master to act such a part to the servants. But what a teacher and master was here! The humility displayed in the transaction was wholly without precedent or parallel. Our Lord therefore proposed the example in an argument from the greater to the less. You call me master and Lord, etc. But fourthly, the seemingly incidental opposition of Peter, verse 6, brought out a discovery of something more couched in our Lord's procedure on this occasion. What I do, said Jesus, thou knowest not, but thou shalt know hereafter. Verse 7. There was a mystery in the transaction sufficient to vindicate its propriety, something of which Peter had no apprehension. This our Lord did not mean to conceal. At some future time, probably by the descent of the Spirit, it was to be fully disclosed. For we learn from what follows that the mystery he referred to did not lie wholly in the example which Jesus immediately explained to the disciples. Peter, not convincing it suitable for his Lord to perform a service so humble, continued to oppose, and in terms that seemed to reflect on the other disciples for quietly allowing their master to wash their feet. Verse 8. On this Jesus unfolded a little of the mystery, and though Peter acted freely according to the natural warmth of his temper, his opposition appears to have been wisely ordered for affording to our Lord an opportunity to disclose the reference his conduct had then to the character and state of the disciples, as well as to the sacred observance about to take place. His discourse and detection of the traitor, previous to the institution of the supper, as recorded in verses 18 through 30, threw farther light on the transaction. Two things pertain to the mystery it involved. Number one, the washing of his disciples' feet might be an emblem of the blessedness they were to experience in their future labors. It intimated that he would be kind to them, would solace and refresh them under all their fatigues in his service, and abundantly compensate for the hardships that they might undergo in following him through good and bad report. Hence, in allusion to what he has done, he describes them in verse 20 as ambassadors, his missionaries. The emblematic transaction was most opposite to the character. For as the feet of such are the members most apt to be wearied or beat, the washing of them, especially considering the mode of traveling in eastern countries, is most grateful and refreshing. The disciples, then, were not only to comfort one another after their Lord's example, but practically to know thereafter his kindness in verifying what he had emblematically taught them to expect. It was at the close of his personal ministry our Lord thus, as it were, refreshed his disciples for all their toils in following him. And we find him elsewhere, describing the future and final reward of compensation by the allusion to something of a similar nature. Blessed are those servants whom the Lord, when he cometh, shall find watching. Verily I say unto you, he shall gird himself and make them to sit down to meat, and will come forth and serve them. And here a footnote. Luke 12, verse 37. He does not speak of washing their feet, because then all their labors will be ended. They will no more need such refreshment and solace as he taught his disciples to expect during their sojournings in his service on earth. The idea in this passage quoted from Luke is that whatever his servants may lack here below, a sumptuous entertainment waits them to be served up by their master. See also Luke 22, verses 27 through 30. But this emblematic instruction does not exhaust the mystery, for secondly, we find from his address to Peter it lay chiefly in the necessity of attending to purity both in individuals and ecclesiastical societies. With respect to individuals, the particular address to Peter intimates the necessity of spiritual purity as manifestative of interest in Jesus. Except I wash thee, thou hast no part in me. The inconsiderate reply of the apostle produced an explanation, by which we learn that the transaction as to him and others did not bear on regenerating influence, but on the necessity of purification even after conversion. He that is washed needeth not save to wash his feet. The regenerated can never fall so as to need to be washed anew. Hence baptism, the sign, is not to be readministered. but much defilement may be contracted in the walk and conversation. Personal purity, however, was not solely in our Lord's view. The transaction was designed to intimate that ecclesiastical societies, even the purest, will require purgation or purgation. This is evident from his extending its reference to the disciples as a body. "Ye are clean," said he, "but not all." The evangelist explains, "For he knew who should betray him, that polluted member who is a devil, a calumniator, and covetous. Therefore said he, Ye are not all clean." Verse 11. A society or church once washed or reformed may not need to recommence the work or engage anew in reformation, but may, as to its general character, be clean every whit. Yet still there are in the purest, as among the disciples, unworthy members who need to be purged out. Here a footnote. The view given may appear too much expanded. There is a fullness of meaning in the uncommon transactions of Jesus worthy of being traced out as far as we have lights afforded to guide us with certainty. The design of enlarging, however, was to prevent any from supposing that by proving one or two of the ends designed by our Lord, as for instance the exhibition of an example, they had set aside the application of the transaction to the point in hand. Consider now this mystery in its reference to the time of the transaction. It was immediately before the institution and observance of the supper. Our Lord washed his disciples' feet. As the administrator of that ordinance, he prepared them for its reception and immediately proceeded to verify what he had done in a mystical form, verses 18 through 35. As the apostle of our profession, he also set before the disciples the necessity of personal purity and of sanctifying the people with a view to solemn service. What they might not fully know at that time, they were to know thereafter, when called to direct and manage the service of the Christian church to which the supper belongs. The modes of preparation for the Passover were not suited to the New Testament feast. They could never be connected with it. Even at the time of institution, the ceremonial fitness of the family of Jesus for the typical ordinance was not to stand for the sanctification required in order to the observance of the supper. Jesus accordingly set about a peculiar preparation, the meaning of which he soon exemplified in the cases of Judas. And it was such a preparation as taught the necessity of a moral or Christian sanctifying of individuals and bodies in order to similar service. The transaction, it may be remarked, does not properly point out the duty of courts or of the overseers of a body in their judicial capacity. They ought, no doubt, to put a difference between the clean and the unclean. It is incumbent on them to exclude the vile from the table of the Lord. But if we attend to the history, we shall find that Judas was not excluded by any act of what might be called judicial authority on the part of Jesus. Some commentators hold that he was actually present. The accounts of the evangelists placed together in their harmony seem to be unfavorable to the idea. Here a footnote. Luke is the only evangelist who seems to represent him as present, but it is well known Luke does not write according to the order of time. He often connects events by their similarity or coincidence in other respects. This accounts for his mentioning the celebration of the supper immediately after that of the Passover, and connecting the declaration about the traitor, which, as appears from John, intervened, with that about the ambition of the disciples, which, according to Matthew, was before the Passover, and that about Peter's denial, which by the consent of the other evangelists followed upon the supper. The words of Luke, chapter 22, verse 21, "Behold, the hand of him that betrayeth me is with me on the table," are to be explained by Matthew 26, verse 23, or Mark 14, verse 20, as referring to his dipping with our Lord into the dish, which must obviously be understood of the Passover feast. This was not the specific exposure of the person. Neither Matthew nor Mark mention his going out when detected, but we learn from John that on his receiving the sop, the intimation to do quickly what he was about, which, it would seem, brought out the question, "Lord, is it I?" and the explicit declaration, "Thou hast said," recorded by Matthew and Mark, he went out immediately. Now this detection, according to the two last evangelists, was before the celebration of the supper. This sop seems to have been taken from the materials of the Passover, which had remained on the table during the washing of the feet. But whether he was present or absent is by no means material. In following out the purport of the transaction, something was done by Jesus to detect and expose him, that a pure communion might obtain. This was done by Jesus rather in his ministerial capacity than as one sitting in judgment on a character. and though the ministerial procedure of our Lord was not always attended with success, it is likely it had the effect in this instance through the operation, no doubt, of the evil passions of Judas, who could not bear to be exposed, verses 30 through 35. As Jesus sustained no office connected with the legal economy, Hebrews 7, verse 13, so he did not exercise any ministerial authority in regard to the due observance of the Passover. But it was his province to see to purity of communion in the supper. Judas had a right in the eye of the church to partake of the ancient feast. A similar right he might be supposed to have to sit down at the New Testament table, since the purposes he had formed were not yet ripened into scandal. But in the eye of God, who seeth not as man doth, he had no right, and therefore our Lord in his ministerial character, by an expressive action, declared to the disciples that they were not all clean, and showed them the necessity of a purgation, which he soon took means to accomplish by detecting the hypocrisy of Judas.